In this project, we're going to focus on a simple, well-executed project. The project title is Say It With a Game, and the concept here is that we're going to reveal a simple greeting or message once a level is complete with a game. So I want to jump into Photoshop really quickly and just draw a real simple sketch of the basic concept. And so what we're going to do in this presentation is I'm going to build a real simple landscape, and we're going to take a rocket object and a model that I'll provide to you, and we're going to control this rocket through a scene, and that once we successfully reach the end of the scene, so we'll launch this rocket and we'll control it, and we'll land on a simple little landing pad. And once we successfully land the rocket on the landing pad, we'll reveal a very simple message. Okay, and the message could be something like, happy birthday, congratulations, you name it. It'll be up to you to determine how you want this to play out. But the basic concept is that we're going to start off by playing a game with a fairly simple level to accomplish. And once we successfully complete that level, again, we'll reveal a message. So the setup for this project, I've provided a couple of different assets, and you can download those from Blackboard. And I've already set up a project, the Say It With a Game project, and I've created a level 1 inside my project. In addition to that, I've also imported the assets that I've downloaded from Blackboard. So I've imported a models folder, and inside my models folder, there's a rocket model, and I'll be focusing on rocket 2, which is the example that I've provided to you in the download. And there is also buried in that in those assets are also a space background. So I'll be using my space background as just kind of a simple background texture for the overall design of the scene. So this is going to be one level. It may compose, the game might be composed of multiple scenes because we are going to have a menu on the front end, and we'll leverage scenes in order to do that. But we'll cross that bridge here in just a short moment. So I want to get to the basic project setup, and I want to kind of focus on usability and aesthetics. Again, the project's going to be very simple, but we want it to be well executed, and we want a logical beginning, middle, and an end of this project. So in order to set this project up, the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to orient my camera so that I'm looking down the z-axis. Okay, so I have a blank scene, and my camera by default is more or less looking down the z-axis as well. And so we're going to really kind of think of this as kind of a 2.5D game. We're going to restrict the camera motion to the y and the x, and we'll have our rocket fly through the scene. So the first thing that I'm going to do, just to kind of get a sense of my space, is I'm going to create a cube. And the cube is going to act as the ground plane for now, and I might decide to change this a little bit later. But the z value, I'll change this to something like 10, so it's moving back in space 10 units or 10 meters. And the width of this object, I really want this width to be along the x. I'll probably set it to something like 200 or maybe even 500, depending on how big I want the scene. So this will be the area at first that the rocket traverses. So I'm just going to reset some values here. I want this cube to be positioned at 0, 0, 0. So I'm just going to reset the position. I'll tap the, didn't want to do that. I'll tap the F key with the cube selected, just kind of reframe, and that'll compose my camera. So the next thing that I'll do is I'll bring in my rocket model. Now, in addition to the rocket model, I will mention that you'll also find some letters. So I've included lowercase and uppercase letters, and this is just the entire alphabet, something I modeled very quickly in Cinema 4D and extruded some letter forms, and I'll just drag this out just to kind of show you what it looks like for now. Now my letters are facing the wrong way, but I'll fix that later. And I'm using these 3D letters as for my message, and it's going to be a very simple message, just a couple words, and so I'll actually kind of compose these letters manually to reveal that message. More about that later. I'm going to go into my rocket models folder, and I'm going to find rocket 2. That's the model that I've provided to you, and I'm just going to drag that into my scene. And you can see my rocket is here. Now I dragged it inside the hierarchy rather than inside the scene, because you may notice that if I drag it inside the scene, I don't have a whole lot of control over where it's placed. However, if I drag it inside the hierarchy, remember that anything you drag inside the hierarchy by default shows up at 0, 0, 0. So that was my quick decision there. So I'm just going to select the rocket, tap the F key, and zoom in a bit on it. Now there is a little bit of work that I need to do on the rocket because it doesn't have materials on everything, and I want to correct for that. Inside my materials folder, I've created a materials folder ahead of time. I'm just going to right click and create a simple material, and I'm going to call this, I'll call this the black material. And I'm calling it according to its color rather than the object I'm going to apply it to, because I will be using this probably in a lot of different locations. So I'm just going to select that color, and I kind of want like a charcoal gray, kind of like not quite black, but very dark gray. So I have my black color. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to use that color and apply that to some simple components on my rocket. So I have all these fins, and I also have the thruster. And I'll just apply that material to the thruster. Now you can see that my little thrust cone down here is black, and I'll also do the same thing for the fins of the rocket. So each one of these fins, I'll just drag this material out and drop it on the fin. Now, of course, you can use whatever color you want. So the model is effectively modeled and materials. Now I do want to point out that when you download the models folder, that comes as an FBX, and so there's a basic material that's been applied to that. Now you can model, if you have Cinema 4D, you can model your own rocket. And this is a really simple shape that I created, just a couple of different shapes, and you can apply your own materials to it, or you're welcome to use the model that I provided. So inside this rocket, I want to set things up because, again, the goal is that I want to take control of this rocket, and I want to apply forces and kind of create a thrust mechanic to where we can send the rocket up in the air based on a key press or a mouse press. Then maybe we can rotate the rocket and kind of move it through space, and with the goal of landing it safely on a landing pad at the other end of our game scene. Now, in order to do this, I want to use physics, and so I'm going to need a couple of colliders. Now, remember, when you bring in models from a 3D environment, by default, they do not have any colliders. So in the event that I selected my rocket, and I went to Components, Physics, and I add a rigid body to it, when I hit the play button, well, first of all, I got to compose my camera so that I can actually see my rocket. So I'll just move my camera over a bit. There we go, and I'll lift this up just a bit. Now when I hit the play button, you'll notice that my rocket falls right through the ground plane. The reason for that, if you remember from the previous project, is that any model that we bring in from an external 3D modeling application, by default there are no colliders applied to this model. So let me correct for that. The first thing I'm going to do, now remember, I selected the rocket object, the parent object, and applied a rigid body. I'm going to go into the rocket body, which is kind of the main rocket element here, and I'm going to go to Components, Physics, and I'm going to choose some kind of a collider that makes sense. Now I could get away with a capsule collider, or a sphere collider. I mean, there's a number of things that I can do, but I'm just going to choose a simple box collider. It's kind of the most efficient collider that we have, and even though the center object is not a box, it's going to give me the collider details that I need. Okay, now when I hit the play button, the rocket falls through and kind of falls to the ground because we didn't account for the fins. Now, rather than putting a collider on each one of the fins, I'm just going to go up to the rocket group itself, and I'll add another box collider. So I'll go to Components, Physics, Box Collider, and the box collider is a little bit small and not exactly in the position that I want. So I'm going to go into the inspector, and I'll just modify some of these values. So I'm going to bump the X up. In my case, I'm looking at about 2.7. And I'm really just looking at the width to see if it accommodates the width of the fin. And actually, maybe like 2.75 in my case. Your case might be different depending on what model you're using. I'll bump up the Y just a little bit. Okay, I'm not concerned about this overlap here, but if I wanted to, I could modify that a bit. And then I definitely need to tweak the Z value as well. So I'm just kind of roughing out And that'll be pretty good. That gives me the colliders that I need, and so I can detect any kind of collision with my environment. I have some, a clear collider down here at the bottom. Now when I hit the play button, my rocket falls directly on the ground. Okay, so that's looking pretty good in terms of the initial setup for the rocket with the physics and the colliders, but I also want to make some real quick aesthetic decisions. When I hit the play button here, it's not much to look at because nothing is lit. So I'll just throw some real simple lights inside the scene. Go to Game Object, Create Other. I'm going to add a directional light. Now this directional light, it's kind of pointing more or less in the direction that I want, but I'm going to just change the colors here a little bit. I'm going to send this a little bit more towards the blue. So I have a blue light coming in. Maybe I'll even saturate that a little bit more. And I'll apply some hard shadows into the equation. The next thing that I'll do is, well, actually before I leave this, I do want to take down the strength of the shadow. I don't want the shadow so heavy-handed, so I'll kind of take that down to somewhere around 50%, so it just kind of lightens up that shadow. Next thing I'll do is I'm going to create another directional light, and I'm going to use this as more or less a fill light. So I'm going to rotate this around to kind of point in the opposite direction. So my key light, or my blue light, the light that's casting the shadows, is coming from kind of the top right. And now my second directional light, my fill light, is kind of coming from the top left. And I might even flatten this out just a little bit. I'll point this up along the X here a bit. And I'm going to take its intensity down, maybe to 3. And I'll change the color. So I'm using a blue light on the one side. And so here maybe I'll use kind of like an orangish light there. So now I get the blue on the one side and the orange on the other, so I have this complementary light setup. That's pretty good. Now when I hit the play button, my scene is lit. My camera's not really composed the way that I want it. So I'll make some decisions about that too really quickly while I'm thinking about the aesthetics. So I'll just select the camera, and I'm really thinking in terms of how big I want this rocket during gameplay. So I'm going to move the camera way back. In other words, I'm kind of making the rocket smaller on screen. And just kind of move this over just a little bit. There we go. And now when I hit the play button, I get a better sense of what that looks like. So the rocket is, pretty small inside this scene, but it's probably not as small as I want it to be. I might even back off the camera just a little bit more. And really, when I'm picturing this, I'm trying to decide if this is my iPad or this is the screen, how big do I want the rocket relative to the rest of the scene. And I'm getting a little bit closer, but I'm not quite where I want to be with it. So I'll continue to play with some of those variables. But for now, I've made some basic aesthetic decisions about the environment. While I'm here, I'll actually get the space graphic inside the scene as well. So I happen to have two. One of these is a Photoshop document. One is a PNG, and I can't quite tell because my extensions are hidden. So in this case, it doesn't really matter. I'm going to select the first instance of space. You should only have one instance of this file. And the only thing that I'm going to change is, by default, whenever you have a graphic in a 3D project, by default, if I select this texture or this image and I look at the inspector, by default the texture type is coming in as a texture. Now I could import this texture and apply it on a cube and use the cube as the background. Okay, and if I wanted to try that technique, I could just create a cube. With this cube selected, I could make it really large along the X and the Y. So let's say I make this, let's make it 40 for now by 40. Oops, that was the wrong direction. I wanted 40 along the Y. And I'll just set this to 1. So I have I have the play button selected. I gotta toggle that play button because if you remember, if you make any changes while the play button is on, I forgot that I was running my game. Any changes that you make immediately go away. So let me try this again. I'm gonna create a cube, and the cube is gonna be 40 by 40. Okay, and that's just kind of just a placeholder to get started, and I'll move it back just a little bit. Now I could take this material and drag and drop and apply it, and now I more or less have this cube in the background that's acting as space. Okay, and just some little star speckles here. That's one way to handle it. Now, of course, I could resize this cube and reposition it, and that would work just fine as a background graphic. But another way that I could do this, I'll just delete the cube, is with the material selected, rather than importing it through the inspector as a texture, I'll go to the texture type and I'll choose, somewhere in here is Sprite 2D. So once I change it to a 2D sprite and I hit the apply button, when I bring this graphic in, I'll just drag and drop it. I now have a two-dimensional sprite, okay, and it comes basically on this this plane, and I'll just kind of move it in the background here. I'll lift this up just a little bit, and now I'll scale this graphic up. So maybe I'll scale it up to 4. Oops, by 4 along the Y. And now I have this background element that I can use inside my game. There we go. Now when I hit the play button, you can see I have my outer space background. So, you know, two different ways to get that background element inside the scene. And I'm going to let mine stay in the space as a 2D sprite. I think I got a little bit more control over it as a background element. So take some time, get your project set up, make some quick decisions about the basic aesthetics of your scene. And then the next presentation will push this forward just a little bit and start to think about some of the mechanics to start to control the rocket. But we'll do that in the next presentation.